Hello and welcome to another edition of the Change Exchange. And today I'm so happy to be speaking to someone that I met probably, 10, 20 years ago, Jonathan?
Gee, I can't remember when we met, but it was a long time ago.
Very long time ago. Jonathan Zapiro, much better known to all of us as Zapiro, the cartoonist and stirrer. Thank you for giving us time.
Great, it's good to be with you.
Jonathan, we're talking on the Change Exchange about change, about decisions, about how one moves through life and what takes you where and how you come to those decisions. You were a white boy growing up in South Africa in the 70s, 80s, and you were destined for the army at that point.
Yeah, there's something about change that is either sometimes catalytic, like a big moment, or there's a sort of osmotic change, that sort of slow burning thing. And I had that slow burner stuff for a long time before the army situation. I really think that my mother was the person who defined a lot of what I understood about the injustice of what was going on. But as you said, a white boy growing up in a privileged white school, going to university, it takes something to actually move you out of that. I mean, as a child, I even remember when Patriot died, and I was 8, I think, and I was in sub B, grade 2.
I was in standard 6.
You don't look it, but that you were then at that age. But at that point, Patriot died, and I remember going to school and that we had to pray for Patriot. Everyone had dropped their eyes, and there was this great sadness. And for an 8-year-old, all I knew was this was a bad guy. I knew that from my mom, that this was a guy who was responsible for a lot of bad things that were happening to black people. That was all I understood. And I looked around to try and get a sense of whether anyone else had that feeling, and I didn't see it. And so there was a long period in my life where as a small minority within the white community, and there were others, of course, who understood things, but not enough of us at a young age did anything about it.
But then you went to study architecture at UCT.
Yeah, I went to study architecture. I mean, I was really looking for some way to stay out of the army. Seriously, I mean, I wanted to be a
nice
cartoonist.
Long course.
I wanted to do something useful, but I really wanted to be a cartoonist from when I was a little kid. And I thought architecture was a good marriage of sciences and arts and whatever, but really I wanted to be a cartoonist. And during my student years, I would say, even though I felt strongly about the political situation, I was kind of apathetic in terms of what I did. I helped a little bit here and there with the odd campaign. I did a few posters for the left. I went on the marches. I remember finding an image of Madiba from in the library, and it was from a banned book, and making the posters that all the students carried. So I did a few things here and there, but not a hell of a lot. And the big thing was that when in my 4th year, was really thinking, in the 4th year they encourage you to travel and to work. And on my travels, I was already thinking, maybe I should get the hell out of here. And I went...
This was what, about 80, 81, 82?
Yeah, my 4th year would be 81. And...
bad days.
Oh, it was deep, dark days of apartheid. I was on my...
And was the army... I mean, what did it feel like to be a young man and know that envelope is going to arrive?
For me, I was unrealistic about it. I always just thought, I'll get my deferment, I'll get my I'll keep it. And I failed a semester.
I'll think about it tomorrow.
Yeah, and I pulled out of another semester, so I was a year behind, and I was starting to do better in architecture. But I also knew that I really wanted to be a cartoonist. So in my 4th year, well, just before I left, I had a lecturer who said to me, he pulled me away from my work one night. I kept saying to him, he was going to be the one who was going to be examining me the next day. It was somebody I was working for him. He was my lecturer. And he said, come, let's go for a drive. I said, oh, come on, please. I've got to work for the exam tomorrow. He said, let's go. Eventually he pulled me away and he said, see how easy you are to distract. So I said, I'll kill you. And then we sat looking at the view quite near the infamous Rhodes statue, which has caused such a lot of trouble recently for good reason. And as we looked out over the Cape Flats, he said, are you passionate about architecture? And I said, I can't really say I am. Are you passionate about cartooning? I said, absolutely. So he said, well, go, leave, do that. So that was part of it. Then when I'm traveling, I decide to go and visit some famous cartoonists just to see what comes out of it. So I went to try and visit Uderzo, who does Asterix.
The Asterix guy.
Yeah,
yes.
the artist. There was
Yes.
Goscinny and Uderzo.
Yeah.
And I got lost.
This is now where? Paris?
In Paris. I'm in Paris. The French are not, in those days, not particularly helpful to somebody who speaks English. I'm walking around. I think it's his studio, and I mix up his studio and his home, and eventually I land up at his studio at night because it's got so late. So then I find out that his home is not that far away. So I walk, but it still takes half an hour. I arrive at his doorstep of his house, his apartment, his posh area outside Paris, at 5 to 11 at night. And I literally had that kind of thing. I mean, if somebody was filming me, my finger was going to, towards the buzz. I thought, can I do this? And I thought, I'm passing this way once. I've got to do it. And I rang the blooming doorbell. And luckily he was dressed. He comes to the door, very nice suit, and I give him my whole spiel. I'm from South Africa. I'm a student, but I want to be a cartoonist, and I'm a huge admirer of yours. I'm sorry to arrive so late, but I got lost and I needed to see you. And he said, entree. And I realized he couldn't speak any English. And
Oh dear.
His wife walks down the stairs. I assume it's his wife. Very grand staircase in this apartment. She's also dressed, thank goodness. They've been out or something. And then he says something about Afrique du Sud, which he understood. And thank goodness as well that the door opens from outside. His daughter arrives. She's about my age, 20, 21. She's studying English at the Sorbonne. And she then translated for us for about 10 minutes. And he was so amazing. And that was a very key moment for me. I just thought, I'm actually going to do this thing.
But you came back to South Africa, you still finished the architecture?
No. I came back to South Africa and I said to my parents,
I've
I've decided to give up. And they had paid for my studies. And I had studied for 5 years. I had nothing to show for it. And I said, we all knew that the army, by this time I was, as unrealistic as I was about the army, I knew that could be a problem. But I said, I really want to go and study graphics. I want to become a cartoonist. And my parents were incredibly supportive. They just accepted that, and they supported me. But unfortunately that wasn't enough. So the academic people all supported me in both fine art and architecture, but the army started leaning on me immediately.
And?
Well,
did you have to go?
My case came before the army about 5 times. Eventually it arrived back with a massive red stamp saying, we won't hear this one more time. You will report for duty in 3 weeks' time. That was it. And suddenly I was doing really well in graphics. I mean, that was where my heart was. And so I had to drop everything in the middle of my exams. And I just decided to get as fit as I could, because I knew I was going to, if I went into that army, I had to decide the usual thing. Do you go to jail? 6 years jail? Do you leave the country? Do you go underground? I couldn't do any of those things. I just didn't feel I had the capacity to do it, or the money, or whatever. So I said, okay, I'm going to have to go to that army, and I'm going to have to make some sort of stand.
And so what did you do? Well, how did you handle it?
Well, I went to the first guys I saw who had brass things on their shoulders. I didn't know anything about it, and I said, I'm new here. I'm not prepared to carry a gun. What do I do? And they kind of rolled their eyes and looked at each other, and they said, you'll know about it when the time comes. And I kept trying to bring, fast forward that moment of what's going to happen, and people kept saying, you'll know about it. And by the time when I really knew about it was when the corporals were kind of assigned to grind me into the dust. because I was the one guy out of
This
7.
was during basics, so
Oh, yeah.
they were just making you run to that tree and back and to that tree and back, and
yeah.
another so many push-ups
Yeah, I
and
mean,
whatever.
Basically, there were 700 in that particular intake, and there were 3 Christian guys from different sects of Christian religion who had letters from their priests saying that and their church saying that they were non-combatant, that they were pacifists. I was the only one who was seen as a political obstructor in those days. And so I was the one who all the corporals knew that I was the guy they had to kind of work over. So it was very tough for the first 6 or 7 weeks.
And then I see you've brought a prop.
Well, one Sunday
that?
afternoon, the lieutenant decided enough was enough, and he spent his Sunday afternoon making this ridiculous object, which is a fake rifle. It's a lead pole. I mean, if you pick this thing up, it is heavy.
Okay.
It's slightly heavier than a rifle, but it's more or less the same weight as a rifle, and it's a ridiculous object. But I think it defined who I was. By that time, I saw myself as standing up in some way to the system. I was kind of a walking cartoon, because the guys would laugh at, I mean, I would arrive at this thing, and they would laugh, especially it didn't have those screws there. Those were put on later by somebody who thought he was doing me a favor. I wanted it the way it was. It used to fall apart on the parade ground in hot weather. And I would be, they'd say, skouer geweer, shoulder arms, and I'd be going tonk, 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 and doing little sort of mechanics on the parade ground. And so I was the laughing stock of the unit. And by that time, they'd finished grinding me into the dust, so it was just a joke, especially when a corporal made me stand guard with the thing, because he was very low IQ. I said to him, listen, guy,
I'm not really much use.
I said, it's your responsibility if I stand guard with this thing. And he screamed at me in Afrikaans. And so off I went in the ready position. I stood guard outside the most public area of the camp, and he got into unbelievable trouble. It was the best double takes I've ever seen, because I'm standing there, people would be driving home from wherever they were, and then they'd all these generals and majors and whatever, and they'd look and they'd see this guy, and then they'd look back and they'd
But so, did you have to spend the whole 2 years in the army?
Oh yeah.
Sure.
So the first while was really problematic. Then there was the big joke period with this thing. And then I managed to get myself transferred to Cape Town, which is my hometown. And of course I wasn't doing duties with guns and whatever. And it was at that time, as I get transferred down there, and by this time I'm seeing myself as an activist, or a wannabe activist, and I'm teaching myself about cartooning. And at that very moment, the United Democratic Front forms. So it was like a moment that was handed to me. And I was able to grab it. But I went to the launch. Alan Busak was inspirational. I immediately joined the UDF, and I was almost immediately arrested while I was in the army. So there's this weird, strange situation where the army then sent they sent military observers to the trial. There were 15 of us. Funny thing as well is that it was the first time anybody had ever been arrested under the Illegal Gatherings Act in cars. Because the Illegal Gatherings Act was 2 or more people gathered for a common purpose. Yes. But we were in a motorcade. So we were the first ones in cars.
Sure.
And it was a bizarre,
very
jokey
strange
thing.
Time.
I was jumping up and down with my yellow UDF t-shirt and these military observers in white, because I was now in the Navy, in my brown uniform during the day, in my UDF clothes whenever I could, and sticking up Free Mandela stickers inside the army. It was just completely crazy.
And that changed your life forever,
Absolutely. I mean, it was, by that time, my whole sense of myself was completely different. I felt like every spare moment was dedicated to the struggle. And I would work for any organization where people needed cartoons, posters, pamphlets, stickers, and I was just doing the usual, area committee, the UDF area committee, sort of general activism.
So your cartooning was never just for its own sake. It was always, you always saw it as a weapon, as an instrument.
Well, when I was growing up, I was thinking of comics and cartoons. I was influenced by Giles and by Tintin and by Asterix and by Peanuts. And one political cartoonist, David Moreau, who's an unsung hero of political cartooning, a left-wing cartoonist who worked in the Cape Times from the 50s through to the 70s. But my own cartooning was really just generally about cartooning until that period.
Light and fun.
The early 80s, suddenly there was a real purpose for it. I mean, I felt I was an activist cartoonist in equal measure for that period of 6, 7, 8 years.
And then you got a Fulbright scholarship to go to America. And
yeah.
How did that influence you?
Well, by that time, if you have a period of 6 or 7 or 8 years or whatever of activism, it's pretty damn tiring. And I mean, it's exhausting. And by that stage, I'd been detained without trial by the security police, and I wasn't the only one in my family. So had my mother and my sister on other occasions, and lots of my friends. And we were really working ourselves to the bone, and we were harassed constantly. Phones were tapped. Friends were being taken in. People who were much more key in the movement were being taken in for long periods, and we were hearing about torture and all of that. It was very hard. So it was also incredibly exciting. But I wanted to get a different perspective, and I wanted to get some of that training that I never got because it was cut short by the army. So I applied. It's actually my girlfriend, who's now my wife, Karina, who suggested to me, why don't you apply for a Fulbright? And I said, my academic record is
useless.
By that stage, by the way, strangely, I had been awarded a degree after the fact. Anyone who started the year I started, this was really fortuitous. I mean, it's just out of the blue. Anyone who started in 1977 or after and finished 3 years of architecture suddenly got the degree as they split it into 2 degrees. So I was able to apply for a Fulbright because I had an undergrad degree. Not that my record was good, but I had also a really good portfolio of work. I had good sort of social, they're looking for people who have social involvement and certain aspirations of doing things in the social arena. And all of that was as strong as anyone they got there. It's just my academic record was about as weak as anyone who's ever been given a Fulbright. And one day they called me up, the Fulbright committee, and they said, look, it looks as if, you've applied to do a master's, but we don't even know if you need a master's. I mean, obviously that's the way you would normally get a Fulbright, but how would you feel about a year of non-degree study at a school of your choice?
What a gift.
In America. So I said, thank you very much. And I applied to and was accepted at the School of Visual Arts in Manhattan, which was my first choice. And that was because Art Spiegelman, the great Art Spiegelman who did Mouse, the Holocaust story in graphic novel form, of his own relationship with his father and his father and mother's survival of Auschwitz. And it also changed my life to read that book. And so that's where I went. And the weird thing happened on the day I arrived. I went to sign up, and that was the thing, of course, I was most excited about. And they said, Art Spiegelman, he kind of hasn't taught here for about a year.
Oh dear.
Yeah. And so I was devastated for about a day, and then I thought, okay, I regrouped. Said, well, there happened to be Will Eisner and Harvey Kurtzman, 2 absolute giants of cartooning who are teaching here, so I'll go to their classes. And I loved that. And after a year of study there, I was doing really well now. I was really nailing all the courses, and the school gave me a huge exhibition in New York, and at a place that they normally reserve for the alumni of the school. And the head of the school, who happened to be named Rhodes, by the way, which is quite good. Anyway, he comes up to me and he says, is there anybody, this is great, anybody you'd like to meet? So I said, well, there is, come to mention it. And I told him the story of Art Spiegelman. He was very, very embarrassed. And he immediately set up a meeting. And I ended up doing an independent study with Spiegelman for a semester.
Yes, how fortuitous was that? Yeah.
So, I mean, I've been incredibly lucky and been taught by some of these great comic masters. not editorial cartoonists, but it's all fed into this thing that is this genre of cartooning, which is a kind of a language and a series of conventions, and it's a way of thinking.
It is a language, and you have to. Your audience has to understand your language. You have to find the right intonation, the right dialect.
Very much so. I think when I was doing cartoons in the 80s, my friend Andy Mason has described that period. Andy is a comics artist and also a historian of South African cartooning. He's written a brilliant book called What's So Funny, and he described it as the period where the ink turned to blood. And we were influenced by the British graphic cartoonists, people like Ralph Steadman and Gerald Scarfe, who were that spatter and that manic kind of craziness. There was only one cartoonist here who was able to match them graphically. That was Derek Bauer, the great, great Derek Bauer. I don't think politically so much. He was an anarchist cartoonist, but he was phenomenal graphically. And I tried as well. And I felt I got a certain distance. I had more of a political understanding and political bent. But when I went to study in America, I started to understand that you also needed to be accessible to people. So if you're going to hit them over the head with a savage graphic every day, that's going to be hard to speak to people. So in a way, if you don't care so much, but you just want to produce real savage stuff, and you don't care so much about how people are responding and what the dialogue is, then you can keep on doing that. So I deliberately pushed my cartoons towards a more accessible style, and I learned that from some of the comics communication and the comic techniques, and sort of a more subtle thing where you get that little thing to go off in your head where you make a surprise connection, all of that stuff. I learned a lot of that in America, and when I came back, that's what I tried to do.
I was just going to say, coming back into this terribly fraught situation must have been really hard.
It was crazy. I mean, look, even being there when such violence was continuing, being in New York was really difficult. I mean, I did an etching of myself, kind of naked and in this little frame of all the nice New York stuff, and on the outside of the frame I'm sort of looking back towards what is going on, all the burning and killing that was happening in South Africa. So I was very much aware of that, and I was very much aware of my kind of privileged situation being there studying, and I wanted to come back.
You never considered staying?
No, that was never part of it. But, and also one agrees with Fulbright, there's a little contract that you're going to come back to your home country for at least 2 years. Now, I never intended not to do that. That was always part of it. But what accelerated that was that while we were away, my as I said, my then girlfriend, we got married there, Karina and I. And while we were there, Madiba was released and the organizations unbanned, and it took us as much by surprise as it took everybody here. I mean, who knew, except Madiba and a few other people, what was actually going on? And we were devastated not to be. I mean, Cape Town is my hometown, so everybody I knew and my family and all, they were all on the parade when Madiba was released. But thank goodness he came to New York pretty quickly. So we were involved in the welcoming committee, and we didn't get to meet him. We saw him fairly close up, but he was, there were a million people trying to see him. And then,
yes, after that you couldn't not come back.
Of course, I mean that was, so at least we got a chance to be involved,
yes.
And then we came home.
But how do you then, because now you're back, but what is your role? Because you're no longer in opposition, you're no longer fighting against.
Well, I tell you, I was pretty angry already that the UDF structures there were two things that happened in New York that started to shift my head a little bit. And the one was, about the struggle and about what was going on. The one was I was already angry with the ANC for dissolving the UDF. Because the UDF was a very egalitarian grouping that had been doing a lot of the on-the-ground work during that period. So it's not after the fact, like some people look back and say, "Ooh, maybe that wasn't a good idea to dissolve the UDF." For me, being there in New York, when I heard that was happening, I said, "That's crazy. That is crazy." So even though I very much supported Madiba and where the movement was going and all of that, I was already aware that there's something wrong. And that was the one thing. The other thing was how I saw people close ranks around Winnie. When the UDF, before that had happened, the UDF had distanced themselves from Winnie Madikizela Mandela. She wasn't, she was still Winnie Mandela in those days. And I thought, good, because we'd heard a lot about what was happening.
The whole Stompie affair, etc. Yeah.
And the Mandela Football Club, which was basically a bunch of thugs that she had surrounded herself with. And I saw how the ANC closed ranks around her, the ANC in exile. They had said, no, there must be some mistake. And I thought, there's a dissonance between what's going on the ground and some of the people who are out of the country or in jail or whatever.
So when you came back, what did you do? Where did you find your place?
I found that some of those things that made me feel a little disaffected as it happened. And I didn't really know what to do. I immersed myself in educational comics. We did 3 educational comics at that period. I had a little group, and we did it as a collective. We first did an early AIDS education comic, 1992. And then in 93, we did a child abuse prevention comic. And then in early 94, we produced a democracy. I started getting back into the whole idea. As democracy approached, I thought, well, there may be a role for me. I did the official poster for the elections, and I did a whole lot of election education stuff. But I did cartoons for Die Suid-Afrikaan, which is the most progressive Afrikaans journal. And some of them are...
Ike Krog was also involved with that.
Yes, Ike was editing it at one point, and Chris Lowe.
Yes.
So I was keeping my hand in on that stuff. And then early 94, I get offered the Weekly Mail, the coveted Weekly Mail slot as the cartoonist, which I'd always wanted. And it was just about to change to the Mail and Guardian. And so that period, 94, then, as we became a democracy, I was really in the swing of becoming an editorial cartoonist.
So for the first time, you were earning your living as a cartoonist.
That's true.
For the Mail and Guardian and Sowetan, and then later the Sunday Times, all at the same time.
Well, Mail and Guardian, beginning of 94, and then the Sowetan offered me their slot in the middle of 94. So that all began right at the beginning of democracy. And I had to suddenly speak to people in very different newspapers. I did not want to be schizoid. I didn't want to have a different voice in these different papers. The Sowetan was, 95% or 98% black readership. Mail and Guardian was predominantly white readership still, and quite literate. So very different. And that was my big challenge, was to try and find a way of speaking to people across
different language.
Try and work in the same sort of genre and speak to people across these different demographies, and have a strong political voice that didn't show me up as this white boy from Cape Town who was speaking to people in Johannesburg. And it was, well, what was fantastic for me in terms of whether or not I succeeded at that was that for maybe the first 7-8 years I was working at the Sowetan, if I ever went to Joburg, people would say, "You're Zapiro, I thought you were black." So it did work. Yeah.
But those were almost the good years. If we look back at it now, it was the years of idealism. It was also very violent, especially in the beginning, until about 95, 6. But it was the good years.
Well, very much so. I mean, when you have people like Madiba, and you had Walter Sisulu, Tambo had died just before democracy really began. But you had a whole lot of people. Chris Hani also was just killed, murdered. But you had that was the influence of where the movement was going was defined by people like that and that generation. And some of the people within the UDF who managed to kind of assert themselves into how things were going. So it was a very, very, it was an incredible period to be a cartoonist. To have a head of state like Madiba who actually loved cartoons and who actually enjoyed critical voices. And I mean, you said that to me personally. I mean, that was a hugely defining moment when he actually said that to me.
Did he say it about something specific? You put it together in a book later. Do you have examples?
Well, the particular thing that he said was, I mean, this is a story that I've told more than any other, but it is my favorite moment ever for me as a cartoonist. And I was just sitting at my desk on an ordinary day, and the phone rings, and my wife says it's the president's office, and I'm thinking, oh, maybe they want a drawing or something. Anyway, I'm holding the phone in one hand, waiting, and I'm busy drawing, and I've got a pen in my mouth as I wait for a while, and his voice says, hold on for President Mandela, woman's voice. So then I thought, oh, please, that's one of my friends.
Leon Schuster.
Yeah. And then there's hello, is that Zapiro? And I said, yes. He said, this is President Mandela. I said, it sounds like you, so it must be you, which I know is like pretty embarrassing, but that's what I said. And then he said, I'm very upset with you. So I thought, wow, I thought that, I mean, flashed through my head, maybe he is now upset about some of the cartoons that I've been doing. And he was just having a joke with me. It was about he'd seen that I was not going to be appearing in the Argus anymore, Cape Argus, because there was the deal with the Sunday Times was coming through, and and he always loved seeing the cartoons every day when he was in Parliament. It was pre-internet, of course, the internet was just in its infancy. So he wanted to see the stuff every day when he was in Parliament, and he wouldn't see the Sowetan cartoons reproduced in the Argus anymore. So that was why he phoned. But then the point is that I said to him, I'm not only honored and thrilled and all that, and I was a bit tongue-tied for a while, but I then said, you would have seen, since I met you, because I met him in 94, I mean, you would have seen the cartoons getting more and more critical of the ANC and of government. And he said, oh, but that is your job. And that's why it is my favorite story, because I mean, he really understood that thing of criticism, and he really encouraged it. And he loved cartoons. He loved seeing himself in the cartoons. I heard Zelda Lagrange talking about that he talking about some of my cartoons and cartoons in general. And I also had the chance to present him a couple of times with cartoons. So, I mean, I had a sort of a charmed life then. All of a sudden, I was able to do critical cartoons, but at the same time, the people at the very top really appreciated that, and also Madiba himself had this huge regard for the rule of law and for the institutions that he was busy setting up.
But he also understood, that thing that Van Wyk Louw wrote about, loyal resistance.
Oh, absolutely.
And that is what you were doing. Yeah. But since then...
Yeah, actually a term that I often use is a patriotic skeptic.
Since then, I don't know, I don't want to put a date on it, but you've become much more fiery, and it now burns.
Sure. Look, during the Mbeki presidency, some of that started to happen. I mean, I started to question where we were going economically, but in particular, we started to see the things happening in the arms deal, because Mbeki was really behind that in 99. And then even more so, there was the stuff around HIV and AIDS.
And Zimbabwe.
And Zimbabwe you can add into that particular mix, because it was also about Mbeki. What I always say about him is that he saw himself as the smartest person in the room, which he often was, but the smartest person in the room can make big mistakes, can go off on weird tangents. So he thought, I know what's going on in Zimbabwe, you don't. This is the reason that I have to pamper, Mugabe, and even not say anything about Sani Abacha in Nigeria until he's hanged the 9 activists, that sort of thing, where he kept Madiba quiet on that. So that's the kind of thing that he did. And then on HIV and AIDS, he became a denialist in 1999, and I began doing savage cartoons. So then my real savage, hard-hitting cartoons began in that period, 98, 99, 2000. And by the time Jacob Zuma came along, which was actually the end of 2002, that's as early as that, in 2003, beginning 2003, I was already doing very, very savage cartoons of both Mbeki and of Zuma. And things did change for me. I suddenly became seen as not somebody who's sparring and as I saw myself as a visual columnist with an activist bent, which is different from being an activist cartoonist as I was in the 80s. But now suddenly I was an enemy. And that, I think, is the same situation that you found with a lot of people who were in the struggle together, but then some moved into government and others moved into media or civil society, and then are suddenly seen as enemies. I was suddenly an enemy.
But you also set yourself up as an enemy. It was also a choice. You moved.
Well, it's a moot point. I often feel that I kept the same kind of politics, and I think it's easier for people outside of government so I do admit that it's easier for some of us who didn't go into those kind of positions to stay outside and say, I'm going to keep on doing what I'm doing. You're the ones who are changing. So it's a bit of a moot point as to whether I changed. Look, I made an active decision to push hard, but I think my politics and what I was trying to do and the upholding transparency and accountability and democracy is not different from what I was doing in the 80s or the early 90s.
If you say you made a decision, did you think of how it would impact also on the people around you? Because I'm sure your wife, your kids would have been affected.
Well, the clearest example of that, and the one that was catalytic, was the Lady Justice cartoon of Jacob Zuma in 2008. I was angry beyond words at how the ANC had descended to this point where they picked the wrong guy. It was completely clear the only way they felt they could get Thabo Mbeki out, and I agreed they needed to get Thabo Mbeki out. But if they were going to say, well, the only way to do that is to get somebody who is tainted morally and tainted in terms of corruption, Jacob Zuma, and say, well, he's the only guy who we think is charismatic enough and enough of a people person or whatever to take on Mbeki, and who can sort of get another camp going that will actually contest the Mbeki camp. If that's the case, and you're going to have everyone around him and he himself saying there'll be anarchy if these charges against me stick, and so Gwede Mantashe said it, and even Zwelin Zimbabwe, who I have a lot of respect for, said it. Obviously, Julius Malema emerged as somebody saying those things. Bladen Zamande and Zuma himself, which is why I included all of them in that cartoon. And I made that very conscious decision there that I'm going to go for broke.
Did you discuss it with anyone? With your wife?
I did actually. But the weird thing was when I came up with that idea for that cartoon, I often write things down I do a very left brain way of operating with cartoons. I'd write things down, and I hope that the right brain will kick in, the sort of lateral thinking thing. So I wrote down, what the hell is Zuma doing? Zuma is raping justice. And then the right brain just exploded, because I suddenly realized justice is a woman. Metaphorically, it's Lady Justice. And that was and I suddenly drew that. I drew the first little rough of that image. And I promise you, I'm not making this. I mean, I went, and the weird thing was,
everyone who saw
everyone who saw the rough of that cartoon and everyone who saw the actual cartoon. Well, again, my friend Andy Mason, who I mentioned earlier, he wrote an article called A Sharp Intake of Breath, which was about what the reaction of that cartoon, the reaction to that cartoon. Anyway, I sent the rough to my editors, Mondli Makanya at the Sunday Times. And I sent it to him about a day earlier. He was really surprised because I'm notorious for being late. And I sent this thing. I said, no. He said, listen, I'm at a restaurant. I said, Mondli, you have to see this. I need to know whether I'm going to do it, and I've got to think it through. So he tells the story about the waiter. I had to fax it to the restaurant, the rough. And he tells the story about this waiter coming across with this fax. And suddenly the waiter, he said the guy was, Mondli tells us, he says a black waiter suddenly went white. The waiter was looking at this thing, and he suddenly, his jaw just dropped. Then he handed it to Mondli, and he also reacted. Everybody reacted. But
what was Mondli's reaction as editor?
He phoned me and he said, he said, he says, he's an age comrade, that is tough, but it's what needs to be said. And then I got cold feet. I got cold feet not because of Zuma or the politicians or the repercussions, but I suddenly thought, how would women see that cartoon? A gang rape situation or potential gang rape. And so I showed my wife, she was also absolutely shocked, Karina, but she understood what I was trying to do. But we decided that the best thing would be to send it around to some female journalist colleagues.
And all this had to happen within 24 hours.
Yeah. And we sent it to a couple of, and they all told me that it knocked the breath out of them. And then they looked at it for a minute and then they said, but it's right. And when the cartoon was published, apart from all the heavy reaction, one of the best things was that on the talk shows where I was getting savaged by people politically and supported as well, but there were women who phoned up and said, look, I'm a rape survivor. Some said, I'm a gang rape survivor. And initially, I was utterly shocked. And then I looked and I said, that is my experience. And so there was that other level of what happens in this country, the patriarchy. And as it happens, Zuma is a huge icon of that kind of patriarchy. And he, as happens, had been through a rape case himself. He, of course, was acquitted. And the cartoon is metaphorical, so it's not about his rape case. It's about a metaphorical figure of justice. But it was a massive moment for me, of course.
Have you ever regretted having done something? I can see that this one you thought through, you tested out, you were absolutely sure. Have there been moments when it wasn't as thought through and afterwards you thought, maybe I shouldn't have?
Look, even though cartoonists shoot from the hip and have to get drawings in within a few hours or maybe a day, I do think a lot about this stuff. And if it's very controversial, I speak to my editors. I really value that kind of dialogue. So I don't think there are many instances where that's happened, but I can think of a couple. Maybe two, because one is one where I personally can't look at a cartoon that I did, which was also dealing with rape, but it was a Charlize Theron did a series of rape
ads,
anti-rape ads, which I thought were great. And then there was this Advertising Standards Authority that, because they got a couple of complaints, like 2 or 3 complaints, they pulled the ads. So I did a really harsh cartoon about them. And I shot from the hip too quickly and I didn't think it through and it was too graphic. It was like women of South Africa being raped again by the Advertising Standards Authority. And it's a very anal kind of cartoon to look at. And I do regret doing that one. I did a better one of the issue afterwards, a much more interesting one. But the other time was also, of all the cartoons I've done about Zuma, I don't regret any of them, except one. I'd been to a party and we were asked to do a limerick. And I did a really nice limerick. It was about public figures. And I did one about Brett Murray and the Spear and Zuma. And it was a very funny limerick and people loved it. And I did a little drawing that went with it. And it was such a hit at the party. I thought, well, I'll find a way to get that into the newspaper. But the context shifted. And I didn't quite get that. And I probably ended up being the only one who thought it was funny in the newspaper. So I then I'm sitting in a hotel room in Venice, and my editor phones me up from Cape Town and says, from Joburg, and says, listen, everybody's on your case, even people who normally support your stuff, that everybody thinks. So all the commentators and the lefties, and they all said, no, this is just what's happened to Zapiro. So that was very difficult. I had to write a statement, and luckily that hasn't happened very often, but well, that's the only time. But that wasn't my finest moment.
Are there things that you still aspire to? Do you want to write a graphic novel? Do you want to do something?
As it happens, yes. That's seeing as you put it theoretically like that. I would like to. I don't feel that while I'm doing editorial cartoons and while I take so much time to do them and I go around and do lots of talks and all, I just don't have the time. And I'm doing some other interesting projects as well. So there are things I can do concurrently with my editorial cartooning, we're making figurines. We're soon going to be releasing little figurines of political figures. And that's incredibly exciting. I'm working with a fantastic sculptor. But autobiographical stories of things that of experiences, some of my most interesting stories, I really like to do them in comic form. So not necessarily graphic novels, but kind of graphic journalism or graphic autobiography. I'd love to do that.
Okay, we'll look forward to that. You've been married to the same woman as I have to the same man for more than half our lives. What makes it work?
We are very different, which I think is, that complementary thing. As kind of manic and disorganized in some ways as I am, she is structured and balanced, and Karina has got tremendous. She's got tremendous focus, and she can also she thinks ahead. I think in the moment, or just ahead, because that's all I can accommodate. And she has foresight. She kind of plans where things could go. It was her idea to apply for the Fulbright. Her idea to, so a lot of the things that we've done have been because she has that sort of sense of where we could go, and she has that balance. I wish I had balance, but I don't. I'm very all over the place.
What do you enjoy most about her?
Her mind. That she and I are. Despite that difference, we have this incredible conversation, and we can talk and think things through. And she's we've now been together since 1984. So it is a long time, and it just feels it sounds cliche, but she really is a kind of rock for me. She holds everything together, and she's also an exciting personality.
And the kids you have too?
Yeah, we have a 19-year-old son, Tevye, who's just been on a really wonderful gap year. He didn't know exactly what he wanted to do, not precisely. Figured some of that out during his gap year. He was in the United States, in Nicaragua, then went across to some places in Europe. Now he's studying humanities at UCT. And so he's been there during the whole ruckus around the roads. It's a very, very fascinating time to be there. Our daughter Nina is at Westerford. She's in grade 9, and so they're both very interested in drawing. Tevye did very well in art and in drama, but he's not studying those. Nina, who knows what she'll do.
How did they change you? Children change you?
Well, I think that there was an attempt on my part to try and get more balance, and that it's succeeded to the point where we do wonderful things together. We have particular areas that we bond over, and I think that's been a wonderful thing for me. Whether I used to make sure that I read to them every night, and we dissolve in fits of laughter and all of that. So we had a strong bond. I've had that with both of them, and then going on trips with them has been something we've really tried to do. Sort of experience bits of the world together, and it's different from when you're traveling as an adult by yourself or just with a partner, to see things a little bit through their eyes and try and help them get those experiences. That's been fantastic too. And
home, Jonathan, you've always lived in Cape Town. Why did you never consider moving to Gauteng? Your work was there for a very long time. What makes Cape Town so special?
Well, New York is the only place that has been enough of a draw card to get me. I can imagine living in New York, and in the aspects of Johannesburg I really love, which are better than Cape Town.
The weather, for one.
Maybe, that's not what I'm thinking of so much. Cape Town, I love, look, my roots are here, my family is here, my friends are here mostly. So there's sort of historic roots for me. And the place itself, getting out over weekends and walking or cycling, hiking, all of that stuff, going to the beach, Cape Town is peerless in that way. It's the most beautiful place. So the historic stuff and what you can see and do, that's great. The part of Cape Town that really eats into me is how untransformed it is. And that really is a problem. I mean, I really feel, when I go to Johannesburg, I love that about Joburg. You can go into places and it really feels like it's a new South African transformed city. And despite what the DA government here will say, and that it's all a big lie by the ANC, it's not true. That Cape Town is quite backward, and in its
still consists of different cities.
It's very cliquey. There's lots of racism here. There's racism everywhere, but Cape Town does have that problem. It's a kind of an enclave of in some ways of sort of old South Africa, very divided.
And the physical space, what is your home like? How long have you lived there?
I mean, one of the nice things about our home, we were lucky enough to move to a place where we do have those vistas out of the mountains that we can see we're right in the city bowl in Oranjezit. So there's actually one window up in our attic where we made those. There's a table tennis. I love table tennis. We don't play enough, but we've got a spot there where we can play ping pong. And there's a window there where if you look carefully in all directions, you can see all the major mountains. You can see Table Mountain, Devil's Peak, Lion's Head, Signal Hill. So we have great. It's good. It's great views and great openness, which I love about the house.
And how long have you lived there?
As old as our daughter's 15 now, so we've lived there for 15 years. And
what made you choose that house? Is it the view? Is it the open spaces inside?
Yeah, the views and the openness were huge, but it also it's got comfortable spaces. I mean, places. I feel what makes a house is places where you want to be. Whether you want to be private or you want to be sitting looking out at the view, so it has got those things. And one other thing it's got, which we were looking for, is a separate place for me, because I'm not making light of this. The sort of mayhem of the cartoonist studio. A cartoonist's head is a strange place, and a cartoonist studio is just an extension of that. So I mean, there's deadlines and there's lots of swearing and there's lots of mayhem and all that, and it's actually not good for that to be in the house. So I'm connected. I mean, I just go up and down the stairs, but I can be completely separate, and all my stuff is in my libraries. I've got a huge library. So that was something we looked for, a place where I could have a totally separate place, which has still got nice views and everything. So that's one of the things I also value.
Well, I hope you have a chance to create your book at some point, and you will let us know.
I will.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks,
Thank you. Till next time. Goodbye.